much. How's everyone doing this afternoon? Can't hear you. How's everyone doing this afternoon? Thanks everyone for coming out. Today, my name is Arkan Fung, and I'm a faculty member at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I work on democracy and participation issues. And here this afternoon, we're about to talk about the vote. And the vote is the most fundamental act of American democracy. Hold on, my slide is not advancing. Sorry. Uh-oh. What's that? Oh, I wonder if it's interfering. Yeah, I'm trying to. Never mind. It would be good to have the. Maybe I'll just do it. Yeah, that's one way to do it.
Never.
The vote is the most fundamental act of American democracy, and yet very few of us actually turn out to vote. Even in a presidential election, the number of people voting that vote for the winning candidate, that voted for President Trump or President Obama, is actually far fewer than the number of people who didn't vote at all. If in the last midterm elections in 2014, about 2/3 of Americans, eligible Americans, didn't cast a vote at all. So here we're talking about whether we can do better than that. Certainly we ought to be able to do better than that. At the Kennedy School, along with a few other organizations like Democracy Works and Common Cause, we're trying to put forward an idea that the equivalent of a moonshot for American democracy would be getting to 80% participation. What if 80% of the adults in America actually voted? What would that be like, and how could we get there? How are we doing compared to the 80% goal? Right in the last 2016 elections, 56% of the voting age population cast a vote for the top of the ticket. That's not very far, that's pretty far from 80%. So we'd have to increase it by about a quarter to get there. The United States does not do very well compared to other democracies. As a matter of fact, compared to 35 countries in the OECD, we're 28, near the bottom of the list. That's not a very strong showing. The good news, though, however, is that there is a segment of America that already has gotten to 80%, that already is voting at a rate of 80%. The bad news is that it's families with incomes above $150,000 a year. That's about 15% of households in the United States. So they're already voting at 80%. They've already gotten to the moonshot. Everybody else, however, is far below the moonshot. As you can see, people who have relatively low incomes, households making less than $20,000 a year, are voting at rates less than 50%. They'd have to increase a lot, 30%, 40% to get to the moonshot. Let's talk about race. White non-Hispanic Americans are the racial and ethnic group that votes most frequently. They're at 65%. Everybody else is significantly below that, with Hispanic Americans, the lowest among these four groups, at 47% a voting rate. Generationally, older Americans are almost at the moonshot goal. Folks 65 and older are at 73% participation. They just need to nudge it up a little bit. However, really young people, college-age Americans, are voting at a much, much lower rate. Only 43% of them turn out to vote. So we'd really have to crank it up for them to get to the moonshot. But it is possible. Some states are almost there. At the very top of the list in the US is Minnesota. 75% of adults in Minnesota turned out to vote in 2016. It's incredible, a high rate. But the rest of us are pretty far behind. The lowest four states in the union are New Mexico, Arkansas, Texas, and Hawaii, with quite low voting rates. Now, what's good about voting? I think maybe for me I think it'll vary. Like everybody has a different answer to that. For me, the most important thing about voting is part of what it means to be an American, part of our civic responsibility. That's one thing that's good about it. but there are other things that are good as well. First, equality. Everybody, no matter who you are, how old you are, what race you are, what income level you are, you ought to have an equal chance at exercising political power. There's a lot of different measures of political power, but one measure is who actually represents us, who's in Congress. And I think most people know that there are far fewer women who are in Congress than women in the population. There's far fewer African Americans and Asian and Hispanics in Congress than in the general population. But a couple of these categories are really shocking. 66% of Americans don't have a college degree, right? 2/3 of Americans haven't gone to college, adults. 4% of people in Congress lack a college degree. A little bit more than half of Americans have a blue-collar job. That is, they work with their hands for a living, not in front of a computer like me. 2% of people in Congress, their last job before becoming a politician was a blue-collar job. So in some ways, people without a college degree and blue-collar people are the least represented in Congress, even when you include groups that we think a lot about, like Asians or women or African Americans or Hispanics. Is that me? I think that's outside. A second reason to care about voting is responsiveness. Now, in a democracy, you think, well, the more the percentage of people who want something to happen, the greater the likelihood that government should do that thing, right? That's what responsiveness is, right? If 90% of Americans want government to do something, then government should do that thing. And if only 10% of Americans want government to do something, probably government shouldn't do that thing. That's one of the things it means to live in a democracy, right? So this is a little graph here. The green line indicates a responsive government. When more Americans want something to happen, government's more likely to do that. The red line indicates an unresponsive government. It doesn't matter how many folks want something to happen, government just it's a coin toss, right? A couple of political scientists, one in particular, Marty Gillens, did a study over the last couple of decades to answer the question, how responsive is American government? And he looked especially at issues in which better off people had different views from people who were less well off. And he found that government is not at all responsive to people in the middle of the income distribution. It's basically flat. If you're kind of in the middle of the income distribution, doesn't matter whether 90% of those folks want something to happen or 0% want something to happen. It's kind of random whether or not the government does that thing. However, government is responsive to some citizens' views, the top 10%. And Marty found that if you just look at people in the top 10% of the income distribution, roughly households making more than $150,000, no, less than that. Yeah, $150,000 a year, government is very responsive to those folks, right? So in some ways, it's a democracy for the 10%, much less of democracy for people who aren't in the top 10%. And finally, institutional trust. In a democracy, we ought to trust our government. When John F. Kennedy was president, 75% of Americans said that they thought they could trust people in Washington to do what's right all of the time or most of the time. And now that number is down at about 20%. So trust in government is very, very low. So I think that if more people voted and more people participated in the political process in other ways, this would get better. How can we get to full participation? We're going to talk about a lot of these ideas this afternoon, but you can kind of think of them in three buckets. There's some policies we could take. We could try to change culture, and then organizations, companies, schools, universities, governments could try to do some stuff. There's a lot of ideas about public policy to increase participation. A lot of these are really good ideas, and we should talk about them. Civic culture is a harder thing to change. How can we change the idea that voting is something that individuals do privately to a public responsibility? How can we change the idea that companies, schools, that voting is not for them, right? How can we get companies and schools and other kinds of organizations to think that it's part of their civic responsibility to encourage full participation? And then finally, another part of culture, how can we change the idea of voting? A lot of people in this room, maybe everyone has voted. It's kind of a pain. You got to do it before you drop off maybe after you drop off your kids, before you go to work, on your way home from work. How can we change the act of participation from a chore to a celebration? And then organizational commitment. At Harvard, we've committed to the Harvard Votes Challenge, and at the Kennedy School, what that means is this year, we're trying to get 90% of Kennedy School students who are eligible to vote to register, and I'm very happy to report that we're almost there. We're at 88%. So if 7 more students register, we'll hit that 90% goal. The idea, Harvard, the demographic's not the most important demographic to get out to the polls. There are many, many others who turn out less than Harvard students do. But the idea is that we want to walk the talk of being an organization that encourages everyone to participate in politics. A little more interesting is that a few years ago, the United Auto Workers, in their contract negotiations with the big three, Ford, Chrysler, and GM, negotiated that Election Day would be a holiday for all the union members for the next 15 years. So if you work for the big three, Election Day is a holiday for you as a result of this collective bargain. And then soon after the members of the union got it, executives at the company said, well, it doesn't make sense for just union folks to have it. Salaried workers ought to get that day off also. And so if you work for the big three, Election Day, at least for the next 15 years or so, will be a corporate holiday for you. All right, so today we have some great, great folks to talk about organizational commitment to the democracy project. To my left is Katie Peters. And Katie is the CEO of, the Chief Operating Officer of TurboVote, where she is responsible where she's responsible for directing the 6 million, the care and feeding of the 6 million or so customers. I don't know, they're not customers really, they're users, voters, hopefully most of them are voters, that participate in the TurboVote platform. And for those of you who don't know what TurboVote is, you'll learn more about it this afternoon. And right after this session, I encourage you to go to TurboVote and sign up, even if you're already registered. It'll make the process of voting a lot easier for you. Corey Kenna is from Patagonia. She began her career on Capitol Hill with Congressman John Lewis and Senators Zell Miller and Tom Carpenter. At Patagonia, she oversees all product, brand, and internal messaging and communications, and she's currently leading many efforts, including public lands, but for our purposes here, the amazing political efforts and voter engagement and participation efforts that Patagonia is undertaking. John Horton is from Lyft. He works on public policy there. He's worked in community affairs across the country, all over the country at Lyft since 2016. And before that, he worked also on the Hill for Lamar Smith, Congressman of Texas. So welcome to our panelists. And we thought we'd just kind of ask a few questions to get things started among the panel and then open it up to everyone else. Great. So, Katie, I don't know if this is actually true, but my friends tell me that it's harder to vote in the United States than in just about any other country in the world, which is kind of an amazing thing to think about. Makes sense from the data. What is TurboVote doing to make it easier for people to vote, to take the friction out of voting?
Yeah, I wouldn't say anywhere. I spent one summer while I was at the Kennedy School helping do voter rights monitoring in Afghanistan, and I still might give them the hardest place to vote credit. But no, 50 different states worth of rules, nearly 9,000 distinct local jurisdictions getting to carry that out and really being the front lines of democracy mean that knowing what voting looks like where you live is a hyper-local question, and so it's a really hard one to answer. The answer is always, it depends. Can I vote early? What state are you in? When is the deadline to register to vote? When or how do I get a ballot by mail are all questions that I can't give you a single answer to sitting on the stage without a lot more context about where that voter lives. And so for TurboVote, what we set out to do was track all those rules, track them by geography, and make it possible so that anyone can come and give us their address, and we can say, all right, this is how it'll work for you. Let's walk through it step by step. So if you come to turbovote.org and sign up, we'll get your name, we'll get your contact information, and then we'll say, all right, here's your options for registering to vote. Your state has online voter registration. Or they don't, here's a paper form, you'll need to print it and send it in. Your state is going to allow you to request a ballot by mail if you prefer to vote that way, versus your state requires that you have an absentee excuse, and here are the excuses that you would need to, that one of them would need to apply to you to vote by mail. And so we've built effectively a voter concierge that lets anyone walk through and find the process to be as understandable and welcoming as possible, tracking across 50 states worth of rules.
That's great. Thank you very much. So, Corley, everybody thinks of Patagonia as an outdoors, recreation, nature, friendly company. And so, in terms of corporate social responsibility and activism, one expects from Patagonia work on public lands, on conservation issues, on many environmental issues, but not necessarily on democracy and voting issues. So why is Patagonia invested in that, in getting people to participate? And tell us about some of the things that you're doing in order to make good on that commitment.
Yeah, thank you. The two really go hand in hand. I think we wouldn't be good advocates for the planet if we sat at home on election day. And our company culture is a lot about being responsible stewards of our resources, but also being responsible citizens. And as you said, one of the most important responsibilities that we have in our society is voting. And if we didn't vote, then our democracy would fall apart. And so, so they really do go together for us. This year, in fact, it really came to life yesterday, but you'll be hearing a lot more about this in the coming weeks. We're talking to our community about how democracy requires showing up. And we're using these numbers that, you know, in the last midterms, there was only 36% turnout, and that's pathetic. And so, as our founder says, get off your butt and go vote. And so you'll be hearing more about this in the coming weeks from us, but it is about being engaged citizens. It's about being responsible with our democracy, which requires us to show up. And then the and for us is and looking at our leaders and making sure we're holding them accountable and that they are taking care of our planet. So
that's great. Thank you. John, you're obviously working in a technology company, a startup company, and you know the word or the term in a lot of the Valley and in your industry is disruptive innovation. And especially for ride sharing, sometimes that doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with making government work, right? Sometimes some ride-sharing companies have, and some disruptive innovation has taken an adversarial approach to government. Lyft, especially in some of the democracy work that you're beginning now and seem quite invested in, it's a very different attitude that we should be strengthening our democracy and collective institutions, not breaking them up with a hammer. How does Lyft get there? From being disruptive innovators to let's make our democracy work better?
Yeah, Lyft has always been a mission-driven company and a values-driven company. It was one of the reasons I came to Lyft 2 years ago. And I think we like to build our product, and getting into a Lyft is a sense of community. Your friend is your driver, your teacher is your driver, your colleague is your driver. And so with that approach, we've always taken a more collaborative approach to working with governments. And as it relates to this issue, we're all about solving problems, right? And if we have a product that is available statewide in 48 states across the country, 96% of Americans can get access to a Lyft, but then we saw in the 2016 election, almost 15 million people didn't vote, and they cited transportation as one of the main barriers to not voting. So we thought, well, here's a problem, we can easily attack it, and that was the genesis, I think, for starting to figure out how we can get more people involved and get more people active in voting. And that's what led to some of the initiatives that we've been working on to turn out the vote.
That's fantastic. So, Katie, how old is TurboVote? Is 8 years old now?
Yeah,
just about 8 years old, and I've followed from the very beginning and the challenges and the amazing growth that you've had to 6 million users now. What have been some of the surprises? What have been like the places where you thought, oh, it was going to be tough, but people really hopped on? And conversely, where are some of the places where it's been tough for TurboVote to get traction and users?
Absolutely. I'd say the surprises have been almost entirely good. I can't think of many disappointments along the way. I'd say that we started with colleges and universities. I think they make natural sense to be talking about civics as part of an education. When you talk about the Harvard Votes Challenge, coming in and saying you're going to spend 2 years or 4 developing these very specific skills and receiving this degree, and one of the things you should leave with is an understanding of how to be a citizen and how to be in a community. And having civics be part of that education has been really valuable. I've been excited by our partnership with Harvard, but also with places like Miami-Dade College, which is a very, very different campus with very different demographics and has still really made voter engagement and voting culture part of their curriculum. I'd say also how surprised I have been that online relationships work. I think that when we talk about our civics, some of that element of human to human and neighbor to neighbor really matters. I think being in your community is a big driver of voting behavior. But finding out that Facebook allowing people to run voter registration drives on their walls brings that very personal relationship component in, and it translates very nicely online. I'd say that Snapchat deciding that they were going to be excited about voting this year is possibly one of the biggest stories in like the 18 to 23-year-old new voter demographic that I can think of. And so I might have been afraid that those were going to feel too distant, or not a close enough relationship, not a trusting enough one, that those invitations might not be as likely to drive voters. And I've been really, really pleased to see that when Snapchat says you should vote, the number of young people who say, yeah, okay, I'll take you up on that invitation is a really exciting one. So.
That's great. Corley, I don't think people know, but Patagonia shuts its doors on Election Day and gives everybody the day off, which, I don't know how those conversations went, but I imagine, maybe the CFO wasn't completely thrilled initially about that. So I'm interested in a couple things. One is, how do the conversations inside go when the commitment to democracy really costs something? Where, the bottom line, in terms of the bottom line, that's one inside. And then outside, do you guys have conversations with other companies and colleagues and try to say, hey, you should do a little bit for democracy too, and how's that go?
Yeah. So I'll take your first one first. There wasn't actually a lot of hand-wringing about our decision to shut down. And we first did it in
And tell people what you do on Election Day.
Sure. So in 2016, our CEO, Rose Marcario, she decided, you know what, we need to make sure everybody here can go vote. And so we're just going to shut down all of our stores, our headquarters, and our distribution center. So all U.S. employees had the day off. And it was for my colleagues, but it was also to send a signal to our community that it's more important to vote than shop on Election Day. And so that was sort of the message out. And the response, both externally and internally, was so positive that she decided to do it again this year. And she did. I mean, she got a lot of notes from people who said, if we hadn't shut down, I would have had to choose between leaving my child at daycare or voting or not coming to work or whatever. And so by having the day off, it removed that barrier and allowed people to go vote. So earlier this year, this summer, she put up a LinkedIn blog post, and she talked about that experience and how we were going to do it again, and invited other companies to join us. And right away, we got a lot of feedback. And then we started reaching out to people that we knew, and got enough interest kind of right away that we could say, okay, we're starting a movement here. It's called Time to Vote. So if any of you work for a company that's interested in getting engaged, and by the way, Lyft is a partner already, and TurboVote, Democracy Works, has been supplying a lot of our resources for this, then go to maketimetovote.org, and we'll talk to your CEO first and make sure you can commit, and then sign up and join us. We now have, I think, around 300 companies that are committed to ensuring that their employees have the time they need to go vote. And It doesn't require shutting down. That was the right thing for us to do at Patagonia, but you wouldn't want Lyft to shut down. We want them driving people to the polls on Election Day. So the requirements are not overly prescriptive, and it is more about CEOs committing to their employees that they have a schedule that allows them to vote. However, it makes sense for them.
Good.
Yeah.
Wow, that's great. So, John, can you tell people a little bit more about the kind of brass tacks of what Lyft is doing to make it easier for people to get to the polls on Election Day? And then, without violating any proprietary conversations, tell us about what else you had considered and what you might do in the future if you're at liberty to do that.
Yeah, so in 2016, we gave ride codes out to vote in certain markets.
And so how do people get a ride code?
And so let me just back up a little bit. As crazy as it is to sound, we've only been around as a company for 5 years. So we're still in like the growing phase of things too. So 2016 was a way to test it. So 2018, it's blown up into this massive, expansive effort. And it all goes back to, I think, around our values. We feel like that being a values-driven company, one of the best ways to express your personal values is your vote, right? And so in 2018, for the midterm cycle, we're partnered with BuzzFeed. You can go onto their website, and everyone in this room, everyone sitting on this panel can get 50% off of their ride to the polls. Because of election laws, we can't give you a ride home because it would be considered us paying you for your vote.
Oh,
so
interesting.
you get a ride to the polls, 50% off. You go to BuzzFeed. It's geo-fenced into your zip code. When you'll get a prompt on Election Day to enter the code if you opt in. It takes you there. It's geo-fenced in, and you're able to vote. And then beyond that, we're giving block grants all across the country to nonprofits to then give free rides to their constituencies. So I manage the East Coast in Canada. A lot of my nonprofit partners are communities of color, Urban League, Voto Latino, several veterans groups, National Association for the Deaf, National Association for the Blind. They're able to get block grants up front. They control that money in those ride codes, and then they're able to get rides for their constituencies to and from. Beyond that, to Patagonia's point, we are closing parts of our corporate offices.
Oh, you are?
For just the offices, not the drivers. Part of our corporate offices to go vote. And then obviously Lyft, we have some parts of our company that are a 24/7 operation. Trust and safety. If you have a problem with the driver, if you lose something, when there's an extreme weather condition, we have a 24-hour team that monitors that. So those guys, obviously, we can't give time off to vote, but their executives are giving 2, 3, 4-hour blocks of time off to go vote. So that's one. And then B is it's all about education, right? So since we've started the educational component of this leading up to the midterms, we've registered about 16,000 new people to vote, and that's all through push notifications on the app. You can come into our corporate offices. We're obviously headquartered in San Francisco. We have 15 offices around the country. You can come in to vote, and just an array of other efforts to try to get people registered to vote. So it's kind of two different folds. And what we considered, we're a startup. One of our core values is create fearlessly, so we consider everything, pretty much. We throw everything at the wall.
Any idea, no matter how crazy.
Throw everything at the wall, see what works, and see what would be the most efficient use of our resources to make sure that everyone's able to vote on Election Day.
That's great. And then so one lightning round, final question before we open it up. And it doesn't have to be about your particular companies. If you had a magic wand and you could wave it to get anything to happen, what would be the one thing that you would pick to try to get to this 80% goal of 80% of Americans participating in our elections? Go for it.
I would have a hard time choosing between two. There is an organization calling Vote Together. It's an initiative to throw parties around elections. It's a thing that happens in a lot of other places. Australia does barbecues. They call them sausage schnozzles. We got to work on the terminology here a little bit in the translation. But I think that idea of having it be festive, having civics not be dour is really important.
And Civic Nation does sponsor
Civic
parties
Nation.
as well?
Civic Nation is the organization behind the Vote Together project. So I would grow them. I would give them all of the resources they could possibly need to throw a party at every polling location. If I get to pick a policy one, it would be to have every state adopt a voting system that looks like Colorado's. They mail everyone a ballot at the beginning of the election system. They have centers where you can go if you're confused or you have questions. They allow you to register all the way through Election Day. It's very hands-on. It's lots of options. It meets voters where they are in the ways that they live today. And I think that it's really served the voters of Colorado well, and I would be eager to see it expand to other states.
That's great. So a policy one and a culture one. Fantastic.
Now I regret not going first.
I'm sorry.
So similarly, I think the best thing, and this is in part because of my own experience on campaigns, but also in what you see in states like Colorado and Oregon that rely on mail-in ballots. If we could switch to a mail-in ballot system that was uniform across the country, so every county in the country had the same way to get a mail-in ballot, and you do it ahead of Election Day, and then on Election Day, we still have a national holiday, and maybe like how Patriots Day used to be here in Boston, it's like a party for the country, and everybody comes together in their community, and we celebrate sort of our democracy and the fact that it works when we vote. So, yes.
And that one you don't
Pretty
have to
nice.
wait for a law. People can start having those parties
That's
in,
right, yeah.
in a month or so. Very good.
I think similar to what's been discussed, twofold. I'm from Texas, if you can't tell from my accent, and as you just described, we're the second lowest voting turnout. So education is one. I think education is key, letting people know when elections are, where to vote. And then B, when I took over the East Coast, I quickly learned that in New York City, congressional, federal elections are on one day, state, city elections are on another. Nobody's going to go, people don't have time to go out and vote.
Yeah.
So I think streamlining and efficiency to put elections all in one day, one cycle, whether it's primaries, whether it's generals, would be another way to help increase turnout as well.
Very good. Great ideas. And some of them, you don't have to wait for government. You don't have to wait for your company. You can throw a barbecue, party, whatever you want on November 7th, I guess. All right, let's open it up. November 6th. November 6th.
Don't vote on the 7th, the 6th.
Don't vote on the 7th. So questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
Is there any estimate for how many people are significantly blocked from voting versus choosing not to? You talked about the number who claimed transportation was an issue. So of the 44%, are half want to but can't? 10%?
Go for it.
Every federal election cycle, the census does a standardized survey of non-voters that asks those, and I suspect that's what Lyft is citing also. So they say, why didn't you? And we've added up, it's somewhere around a quarter say something like, I don't think it really matters. I don't think the system is meant for me, or I don't think my voice is intended in it. It's between about 60 and 65% most years that cite process issues like transportation or deadlines or knowledge, et cetera. So.
Part of the reason we're doing time to vote is another top reason is work and family demands. And so we thought if we just take that away, we could meaningfully contribute to voter participation.
Absolutely.
So I think part of the question is how much is I'll rephrase it as, why aren't you guys talking about voter suppression? I think is another way to ask the question, right? And voter suppression issues, a lack of ID, felon disenfranchisement, those are extremely important issues for people who really want to vote, will show up, but cannot do it, right? My strong suspicion is that if you could wave a magic wand and take care of all of that, you would lift the voting rate a little bit, but you wouldn't be at anything close to the 80% that we're talking about on these issues, which are reducing the friction, making it easier for people to get there through transportation, by creating time, by creating the incentive of this is a fun thing to do and part of what we should do as Americans. But both are very important to accomplish. Yeah, back there.
So you talked about the presidential years being the best vote you ever get. Then it is already from those years. Has any research been done to investigate the extent to which the electoral college system contributes to people not voting? Because in Massachusetts, it doesn't matter who I vote for president. We know which way the state's going to go.
Yeah, we know that competitiveness, when elections are competitive, it really matters, and people turn out a lot more. I think, and that's because they're more enthusiastic, they're real stakes, they care about it. I think for some of the enthusiasm reasons, you'll see a little bit higher turnout in this midterm cycle on November 6th. I don't know the extent to which that effect, I'm sure people have simulated it out about what would happen if the presidentials were decided by more than 6 or 7 states in the country. I think that would make a big difference.
There's a woman waving.
Wait. Oh, yeah, hi.
What are your thoughts on ranked choice voting? I hear it's a lot less contentious, where people can choose their second, third choices. I know Dave's doing it. Do people understand it? Like, what's going to happen?
Do people have views on ranked choice voting?
I think the question of how you implement it is a huge piece of it. I think that in especially some local elections, you do see differences in competitiveness and choice. I think you can also implement it in ways that really institute a lot of confusion and make it much more difficult to, say, audit election results and verify that they're good. And so it's a really interesting idea that seems to be working for some communities at the very least. And I personally feel neutral about its adoption, but it's certainly, there are very few ideas that I would take off the table entirely.
You know, my friend Alex Kazar, who's an historian of the vote and participation in America, points out frequently that we were pretty much at 80% for a bunch of the 19th century, and then it really drops down a lot lower than that. And one of the reasons that it drops down a lot lower than that is because we become a two-party system. And before that, and sometimes in the 20th century, there are more than two parties in a bunch of states, and that participation really goes up when there's more than two parties. And one of the real virtues of ranked choice voting is you don't waste your vote, right? So even if you vote for a third party on your number one and they wash out, then your vote goes to the next highest candidate. So you can vote with confidence for what you really believe in rather than who you think is going to win. And so that's one really good thing about it, although there's a lot of implementation questions. I think we just have time for one more question, and up here in the blue shirt. Oh, wait.
So the question is about 16-year-olds voting, just the room from here.
I think it's worth exploring. I mean, I grew up in a really, really small East Texas town, and we didn't have a civics class. I didn't really come into I was obviously interested in politics, so I got interested in it, but majority of my friends had no clue when the elections were. They had no clue what Democrat, Republican was. They had no clue how our own city council worked. So I think it's definitely worth exploring, because I think, especially with the generation below me, which is Generation Z now, is that what we're calling it?
Is that what they're called?
They seem to be a lot more active and engaged, and they seem to be, like, I often see the March for Our Lives kids on television, and I'm like, my friends and I would have had no clue what they were talking about when we were that age. So they're definitely a lot more engaged, and I think it's definitely something to explore.
I wholeheartedly endorse it. I think high school is a time where you've got a good support network around you to learn those things and develop those habits. And when you're heading off to college, which is what most people are doing at 18, or when you're heading out, you've got all these other responsibilities of adulthood that are competing for your attention. And I think that 16 is potentially a really prime age for having the right level of judgment and sort of the capacity to have that be the new major responsibility that sits on your shoulders alongside getting your driver's license. And I would be excited to see it.
So there's some places where people can vote when they're 16, like Tacoma, Washington, right?
And,
For municipal elections.
And they see higher turnout from the 16 to 18 demographic than the 18 to 22.
Yeah.
So yeah, they might. Maybe it's the 16 and 17-year-olds who will save us all.
I hope so. So one of my senses is I think it would be a really good thing to do, but it would be more powerful if it were combined with civic education in high schools, right? So that it would be a whole package. Not only do you have the right to vote, but you're getting all this reinforcement in knowledge and in culture that you should vote. And you know, now, again, we don't have to wait for the law, right? If I could wave a wand, maybe one of the things I'd wish for is for every high school in the country to have a civics class, and for every graduating senior to register or pre-register to vote depending on, you know, how old when they turn 18, if they're not in a place where they're eligible to vote for local elections when they're 16. We do have time for a few more questions. I thought they were turning the lights out on us, but we're good.
I don't want this to sound like a cynical question, but
If you could speak up a little bit.
the corporate policies that you put in place to allow people to vote, do you have any statistics on how effective it is? How many people actually do follow through and vote versus taking the day off?
Yeah, I don't for us at Patagonia. Sure, yeah. So he was asking about if we had any, or if companies have any data on once you make it easier for people to vote by shutting down, for instance, do you see an increase in whatever? So
Or do people just like
yeah,
watch soap operas for the day?
for us, it would be go surfing, but so we've only done it once. 2016 was the only year, and we didn't do a poll after to see how many people did. I can say the feedback was so positive that she decided to do it again this year. So there was enough of that. And we have talked about, what would it look like to do a kind of survey just to get a better sense of it. I do think, and it's actually, it's been talked about, I know at Democracy Works and TurboVote, that if as part of your company culture in your benefit package, this is where you talk about, one of the benefits of working at this company is you get this amount of paid time off.
Yeah.
And every time you renew, say, your health insurance or something, you're reminded of this benefit. So it sticks in people's mind. I know there is data around that shows there is a higher increase in participation when it's kind of formalized that way, which I think is really important. It's not currently something that we talk about in our benefits package, but I think we'll probably go in that direction, and I think that's a natural next step for this coalition of companies that we're building.
I would just say, just real quick, one last thing I'll say really quick. We have a quick way, not when we close our offices for our corporate employees, but our codes are geo-fenced to polling sites. So after Election Day, we will be able to go in and see how many codes were actually activated to go to polling sites, and we can have empirical data to measure, to your point.
No more questions. We're run out.
We're out of time. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone. So go vote. Go throw a party after you vote.